Welcome back. Alright, today we're going to talk about the equalizers and what they do and how we can implement them into our mixes to polish our mixes, make them sound a little bit better. Alright, so in Ableton, if we go over to our audio effects rack over here in the categories panel, we get all of our effects that load in, and we've got the EQ8 and the EQ3 that comes stock with Ableton. And the EQ8 gives us 8 points of control. The EQ3 gives us 3 points of control. So if we're not doing something very extensive, we could probably go with the 3. If we want to have a little bit more control or flexibility, we might want to load in the EQ8. This is usually the one I go to. It's the EQ8. And we can drag that out onto one of our instrument tracks. I'll put mine on the hi-hat here, and you can see the EQ8 is now loaded in. So the EQ8 comes loaded in with 4 of the 8 nodes or filter controls active and ready to adjust, whereas the others 5, 6, 7, 8 are turned off. And you can just click this little button, click this little box next to the number and turn them on if you need more control points. So let's talk about frequency just a little bit. I'm going to try to make this simple as possible. So our frequency spectrum is a spectrum in which basically the human ear can hear. We've got the low end of the spectrum, so down here you can see where my mouse is hovered over this area of the graph here. You can see that right now I'm hovered over about 34 hertz, which is a very low frequency. We refer to the lower end of frequencies as hertz. When we get up to 1,000, now basically it's 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz. And we can hear all the way up to about 20,000 or 20 kilohertz, 20,000 hertz. So this is a broad spectrum. We have all of our low end down here. We've got our mid-range, and we've got our high end. And if you can break that down even further to, you got your very high end, your mid-high, your mids, your mid-lows, and your very low. Alright, so this is where we can adjust our frequency spectrum. We can have different filter types on each of these nodes here, these control nodes, so we'll just go through a few of those. We don't necessarily need to use all of them. But there's a few you should know about. So one of them is, let's look at filter 1 here. So down here in our EQ8, we've got filter 1, and at the very bottom here, above the numbers, we have the filter mode type. And right now it is set to shelf. So if you see this kind of like sideways Y looking symbol, this is a shelf, meaning when I raise this frequency, everything below it is going to also get raised. If I lower the frequency, everything below it is also going to get lowered. This is kind of versus the bell shape. So this is the more commonly used frequency adjustment type. And this is more of just the frequency being affected right where the note is, and everything else surrounding it kind of falls off. So if I pull the frequency up, only this area gets boosted or pulled down. With this bell shape frequency adjustment filter mode, we can also come down here and adjust what is called the Q. And you'll see this Q, each of these nodes down here in the EQ8 have this area or this little adjustment called Q. And what this Q does is if you raise it, it will narrow the spectrum of audio frequency that you're affecting with that node. So you can affect a broad spectrum as you boost these nodes, or you can affect a very narrow and specific section. So the idea here is that we want to make this hi-hat sound as good as it can, and maybe boost a little of its most natural frequencies, maybe pull out some of the more annoying frequencies. So there's two different ways that you can use an EQ. You can use them together or separately. And one of them is by boosting EQ, is by boosting frequencies. So when I listen back to this hi-hat, what's neat about this EQ8 is it's going to graphically display for me where the frequency of that hi-hat is naturally sitting, and I believe it's somewhere up in this frequency range. So we'll just listen to it, and I'll solo it. So you can see the hi-hat's sitting naturally in this higher frequency range. So what I could do is I could roll off all my low end that's not being used in this frequency so that it doesn't interfere with other instruments that might need that lower frequency range. So another type of filter mode we have here is the low pass frequency and the high pass frequency. And we're going to look at the high pass frequency first. So that is this filter type right here that you can see there's a curve on the left side, which means, I'm just going to pull this down, which means essentially what's happening is it's rolling off the low end frequencies and it's allowing the higher frequencies to pass through. So this is why it's called a high pass frequency. It's a little counterintuitive. You would think that when you're thinking of low end, you would think maybe this would be called a low pass frequency, but it's a little bit different because we're thinking about low end because we want our high frequencies to pass through. So just keep that in mind. A high pass frequency allows the high frequencies to pass through the filter. So now when I listen to this hi-hat, I can see that even though I'm rolling off a lot of the low end here, my hi-hat is not really being affected because there's no low frequencies in there. And essentially all I'm doing by moving this frequency node over is making sure that these frequencies aren't coming through in the low end. Now the purpose of EQing is that we want all of our instruments to fit within the frequency spectrum without interfering with another frequency of that type. So if we have two instruments or two sounds that are competing for the same space in the frequency spectrum, what happens is they compete with one another, and a lot of the times what happens is because they're the same frequency, they end up getting canceled out. So they'll cancel each other out if they're taking up that same space. So the idea here is that we go through each of our tracks and we figure out where they're naturally sitting in the frequency spectrum, and we boost that frequency spectrum, or we adjust that frequency spectrum so that there's still room for other instruments to come through. We only have so much space to allow all these sounds to sit in, and they need their own space to be audible. So let's just do a little EQing here. And what I'm going to do is I like to go extreme. And here you can see I have a high shelf on my fourth node. And I'm just going to change that to a bell shape node. And then what I'll probably do, what I like to do is I like to come over and I'll turn on filter 8, just because filter 8 has the low pass frequency on it. So this is the opposite of the high pass frequency filter. The low pass frequency filters allow our low frequencies to pass through, and they roll off our high end frequencies. So I'm just going to roll off some of these really harsh high frequencies so that they don't hurt people's ears and they don't become distracting in my mix. I'd say about 10 kilohertz is plenty high in pitch. So, you know, if you're rolling off somewhere around 18K or 15K, you're pretty safe to say that you're still going to have a lot of your high-end frequencies there. So let's take a listen to this. And a lot of times what I like to do is I like to just kind of go extreme with my filters, and I do what's called a filter sweep, and I'll just sweep through the frequency to hear where this instrument naturally wants to sit in the frequency spectrum. And we can make this hi-hat sound however we want. I mean, you know, considering. For me, I kind of like where this frequency is boosted here. I might pull it back just a little bit because I just went extreme to see how it's affecting the sound. And then I'm just going to roll off everything else around it. In fact, I can turn off my second and third note because I'm not really using them. Yeah, so that sounds pretty decent. So now when I move into another instrument, say my strings instrument, what I'm looking at here is when I go back to my hi-hat, I'm looking at what frequency I'm boosting here. And if I hover my mouse over this node here, I'm boosting frequencies, and I can see that on the bottom left-hand corner of this frequency display, I'm boosting about 8 kilohertz, at about 8 kilohertz. So if I really want this hi-hat to cut through in my other instruments, what I'm going to do is a little bit different. I might do a little bit of reductive EQ in that 8 kilohertz range. So I'll pull the EQ8 out back onto my strings track, and I'll display this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to change my filter type again. So I'm going to go back to the bell shape, and I'm going to go to about 8 kilohertz. Somewhere in there. And I'm actually going to narrow my Q down a bit. And I'm going to pull this frequency out a little bit. Command Z. I'm going to pull this frequency out a little bit of this track. So now that hi-hat's going to really have some space to cut through. I'll turn off my kick drum. And you can see right away when I'm playing this strings instrument where it's naturally sitting, and that's mostly down in this kind of mid to mid-low area. So in fact, I wouldn't even necessarily need to pull this 8 kilohertz out here. I can just, let's go back to 0. Oh. I'll just boost this up for now. And in fact, I could use a low-pass filter, low-pass filter. To kind of pull out some of that high frequency that this might not be using, and so I can just be sure that it's not going to interfere with anything else that needs to sit in this higher frequency range. So basically what I'm doing is I'm kind of boxing around by using these low and high pass filters around where my frequency spectrum is, around where the frequency spectrum of this strings instrument is, so that I can kind of be sure that no other frequencies are coming through into other areas where it's not even being used. So you can see that my low end is being used here, but I might still put maybe a high pass filter on my low end just to be sure that not too much of the low end comes through and starts to distort speakers and things like that. So now I have this kind of area in which my frequency spectrum is naturally sitting, and I can turn on more nodes if I need more control points. Pull this over. And now I can really get in here and start boosting frequencies for my stringed instrument. I kind of like this area right here. So then what I would do is I would pull the gain down on that a little bit, maybe narrow my Q. So I'm really just kind of playing around to see how I can make this instrument sound just a little bit cleaner, maybe a little bit brighter, or maybe a little more muddy. You know, it's really just a flavor. The idea, though, when using the frequency spectrum, is to keep in mind that all of the instruments together are going to occupy all of this frequency spectrum. So the more carved out you can create a space for instruments to sit in where they most naturally want to sit, then you can really create a really clean sounding track. The thing is like when you just got to think and the idea is to understand where the frequency spectrum is for each of your instruments so that you can then dial it in so that it isn't competing with other instruments. Either if you're boosting a frequency, say at 1 kilohertz on this instrument, then you might want to go to another instrument that might be similar in tonality or pitch and maybe pull that frequency out of the 1000 or the 1 kilohertz range if you're looking for something to really cut through. So just keep this in mind. It's kind of like the frequency spectrum is where you're carving out space for all of your instruments to sit in. And the EQ can be a little bit tricky to learn, but my suggestion is that you first analyze. So I'll just take this EQ8 off and I'll load a new fresh one on here. My suggestion is that you just take a look and solo your instruments and just see where they're naturally sitting in this frequency spectrum. And then what you can do is you can start to kind of trim up around it and boost frequencies in it or take frequencies out of it so that it's not competing with other instruments or that it really has some space to cut through. So play with, I know that we're going to have to talk about the EQ quite a bit more, I imagine, unless you guys really understand it. But it can take a little bit of time to really understand how it's affecting your mix. And if you're hearing things in the headphone on your computer speakers, it's not really going to be that effective in really hearing what it's doing. So this is something that we'll implement more and more as we get into the studio. But this is a part of the assignment, so I do suggest that you start trying out the EQ and seeing how it can affect your tracks. For instance, I can do something really kind of quick here and put an EQ8 onto this drum track. And let's say I want to do a filter sweep. So with this first filter, I'm going to change it to a high-pass filter. Again, allowing the high frequencies to pass through. And I could just do a filter sweep. I can actually do some automation with that. So since I've selected this parameter, here we go, frequency of node 1. Now this line represents that frequency. So I can just create an anchor point here, another anchor point, and maybe another anchor point. And we'll see what this sounds like. Solo. So you can do kind of neat stuff with even doing filter sweeps, and if I wanted to, I could bring that down a little bit slower. So you can really start to see, and I'll just delete that. You can really start to see how an EQ can really affect your you can see and the idea is just, I mean, if it sounds good to you the way it is, it can take a little bit of, training to really hear frequencies and identify them. But if things sound fine to you, then I would say, don't go crazy with it. Implement your low and high pass filters so that you're at least rolling off the really high end things and the really low end stuff, so that you're just not getting a lot of muddy rumble, and you're not making your dog miserable when they're listening to music with you by having these really high pitched elements in there. You're just kind of playing it safe by rolling off the high end, rolling off the low end. And not always, not for every instance, but it can kind of clean things up. And then you're, just going around and boosting frequencies where where you feel that it gives you a little bit higher quality, cleaner sounding audio, and pulling them out in frequencies that might be really disruptive. So you might have a frequency, that you want to, I'll raise the Q on this, and you might want to just pull this frequency right here, like all the way up, because that frequency is really annoying. So start playing around with the EQs. They really can, really give you an advantage and really clean up the sound and kind of clean up muddiness and, get some of those competing frequencies separated so that they all have a space to come through in the frequency spectrum.